the fire. Alhamdulillah. Nice.
Wow. Getting thinner.
Quite back soon.
Well, there's people.
Depends on, obviously. But higher.
It's not working.
You should give a hello photo. Yeah.
Yeah. This maybe get closer to the internet. Okay, good evening, everyone. I'd like to start off by wishing Shalom, Mokim Menachem Eschen, just came back from Levaya. Truth matter, his father was actually a very special person. And the whole family started in the Chama. Okay, we're up to that Memo Mud Aleph, about 12 lines from the top. But in order to understand, we need to go a little bit recap what we discussed yesterday. The Mishnah makes a statement that if you're buying an esrog on Succa, what should you do? What should you do if you're buying an esrog from an Amoritz and Succa on Shemitah? What do? You ask for the esrog as a gift because there's a problem of buying things. The Gemara first establishes what is the problem. What's the problem of buying something from an Amoritz? Okay, let's get the you're not allowed to give money to an Amoritz, which will become Kodesh B'Kedusha Shemitah. He's not allowed to give an Amoritz money for fruit on Shemitah. There is a limit that you are allowed to, up to the 3 meals. And from here we proved that a normal esrog costs more than 3 proper meals. Right? Now, why can't you give him money? That, you said correctly, is a machlokas. Rashi says he may invest it, and Teresa says he may buy with things with it. As Teresa says, there's no limit to the number of halachas there are, what to do with the money of Shemitah. But the point is, that is clear, you can't give money to Namoretz of Shemitah. Right.
And any other money, master money, more simple, you know?
Master money you can, the Shemitah money you
No,
can't. Even just like say allowed to give him, it's only Shemitah money.
More Chagiga talks about when if Shliach. Yeah, the reason I learned it the other day. I found it very strange. More Chagiga talks about Shliach, that if Shliach goes to buy something with master money, even though he doesn't know about it.
Right.
Yeah, and someone sent somebody else with.
Okay, it's a bit off. I hear because
he's more. He's high from Mila, yeah, sure. If
I never knew there was Mila,
money, that, and the Meister, sorry, Shimon didn't realize it was Meister. Sorry, Reuben didn't realize. And neither did Shimon, and Shimon uses the money to buy something. There's a whole machlokes whether the shliach or the mishalech is chayav meila. So why is this any different with the?
I don't know. I have to look into it. Good question. I don't remember that Gemara at all. I don't remember that there is meila b'chalal b'ma'aser sheni. I thought meila was only by hegel.
Ma'aser sheni, but money is kedushas ma'aser.
Ma'aser Mishnah has no kedusha whatsoever. So we must be doing ma'aser sheni.
I don't know. The Gemara talks. I can't remember exactly. So it says there is some shaykhs and money.
Which daf do you remember? No. Okay. I'll look it up. Okay.
You base a thing.
Right. So the Ma'aser, you're not allowed to give money for Tanamoretz because, as you said, according to Rashi, might invest, according to Tesis, he might buy with things which are no good, and therefore you can't give him. You can't pay for the esrog. The Gemara asked yesterday, what about the lulav? What's the Gemara answer? Right, the lulav is not from Shemitah. The lulav comes from the 6th year. The reason is, after a back and forth, it's basically very straightforward. The lulav goes after the budding. The esrog goes after the harvesting. So when you're dealing on Erev Sukkos, not like nowadays, it takes months and months from when it gets harvested and gets to the thing. Everybody would have, you'd go nearby to somebody near to you who had an esrog tree, and you'd buy it from him. So that it's likely the harvesting would have been after Rosh Hashanah, while the budding of the lulav would have been before Rosh Hashanah. But the next, as Chaim put it correctly, the next will be the opposite way around. You're going to have to ask him for the lulav as a gift, and you can pay for the esrog. Right. Now the Gemara challenges this whole idea that there should be a din of Shemitah altogether on the lulav. Why should it be a mitzvah? Why should the halacha of Shemitah even apply to lulav? Shemitah applies to something that you can use, you can eat, but lulav is not an edible fruit. Says the Gemara, 12 lines down from Mem Aleph. Tama de lulav shishis sanichis l'shvisu. The only reason why you're allowed to pay for the lulav is because it comes from the 6th year. Or the shvis, if it's of the Shemitah year, Kodesh. Amai. Eitzim ba'amahu, it's wood. The eitzim ain't b'mishum kedusha shvis. There's no kedusha shvis on the wood. There's not ali konim. Konim is reeds. Ali gefanim, the vines. Shegovon, they collect them. The chayva Rashi explains means to hide, to put away. Apnei asoda. Then depends. Locked on lachila for eating, as Rashi explains, you can't eat these things, but animals can eat it. Yes, b'mishum kedusha shvis. Locked on the eitzim, if it's for firewood, ain't b'mishum kedusha shvis. Anything which is firewood does not have the halacha of Shemitah. And lulav cannot be eaten not by humans, not by animals, and therefore it is firewood. That would be the normal usage of a lulav. So therefore there shouldn't be any din of kedusha shvis. Answers the Gemara. Shani hosam, the Omar call lochem leochlo, lochem dunya de leochlo. Mishana also ubiyuvo yishove yotsu eitzim shana also on achabiyu. Meaning like this. The Torah says regarding the year of Shemitah, beginning of Parshas Bahar, for you to be eaten. From there we dash in the halachas. It's mentioned to eat, not for schar, not for business, etc. But one of the things we dash has to be for you for eating. So we say anything which is similar to eating. Eating, what happens is the consumption of the item is at the same time as the pleasure of the item. While firewood, it's not like that. Firewood, if you want to, for example, cook something, if you make a barbecue, so George always says, you mustn't rush the barbecue. If you put it on too quickly, when it's burning right at the beginning, you will not get the real heat. The real heat is after the wood, after everything's turned into more coals and burnt, then you get the real heat. And if you speak, Grandma will tell me, she talks to me about how she's making pouch with it. She describes how she used to make the fire at the beginning of the morning. What you have to do is it takes time. The wood has to first burn away, and then you get the heat. So therefore, when is the pleasure of the wood? After the wood is gone. So therefore, you cannot use Shemitah for firewood. Once you're not allowed to use it, the same halacha would apply. That means you can't use oranges of Shemitah to cook your potatoes with. Why? Because you're allowed to use oranges for orange juice. You're allowed to use it for eating. There has to be a usage which is lachem leochlo. Rashi says over here we're actually learning two different halachas, Rashi that are dependent on each other. One is lachem leochlo, limits what you're allowed to use it for. Leochlo for eating anything which is like eating. And at the same time, it tells you which things have kedusha shvita. Only things that have the ability to enjoy it, lachem leochlo, that is the purpose of. Then you've got the mitzvah of shvita. Now, the lulav which they used to use for sweeping. Now, sweeping, what happens is the actual lulav gets used up as you sweep it more and more. The lulav, so to speak, gets worn down from usage. But the pleasure of the lulav comes at the same time as the sweeping. The consumption of the lulav, so you're allowed to use the lulav of Shemitah for sweeping, because that's not like burning. Burning for firewood, the pleasure only comes at a later stage. But sweeping, the pleasure comes at the same time as the consumption of the lulav. And therefore it's permitted, and not only is it permitted, but the mitzvah of Shemitah applies to that as well. So that is what the Gemara says, that you have lochem leochlo does apply to the mitzvah to a lulav. Says the Gemara.
Easier answer to say that you guys are using it for mitzvah.
It's hard later.
Is that not an easier answer? To say
No,
that the reason why we
you
lulav
can't.
use on
Because first of all, it would have to include in lochem leochlo, and then
you're using it. So that you're not consuming
it doesn't consume it.
And
also, I'm not sure, but mitzvah lav is the one. If I don't know if using it would be chalat. Says, but there's certain wood which they used to use as lights, meaning it was a particularly oily wood, and therefore they would use it as a lamp. A lamp, if you take a piece of wood and you light it as a lamp, the pleasure and the consumption come at the same time. Most wood goes for burning, and therefore wood in general does not have the halachas and shmita. Let's just summarize. Wood, even though some wood could be used for lighting, for lamps, most wood is used for fuel. Fuel, the pleasure comes after it's consumed, and therefore it's no good. And that it says two halachas. One halacha, you are not allowed to use anything which has kedusha or shmita for fuel, because the pleasure is not coming at the same time as the consumption. So, for example, let's say you've got, I don't know, an orange. You don't want to make it into orange juice. You want to use it for fuel. You can't. That's one. And second of all, anything which cannot be used at the same time as the consumption doesn't have kedusha shmiras. So if you're walking out there in a couple of weeks when it's ready shmita, and you find a branch on the floor, and you decide that you want to use it, you want to do with it whatever you want, the halacha is that it does not have kedusha shmita. I don't get too much into it, but this is a famous shaila, is that there was a person who owned an esrog orchard, and what happened was he wanted that nobody should take it as a. So what he did was he said like this, that the wood of the esrog doesn't have kedusha shmiras, because that can't be used, can't eat it, the wood, the bottom part of the wood. So he's not allowing anybody to take any wood of the esrog trees. And the problem is it's impossible to pluck an esrog from a tree without putting off a little bit what's called the ukkah, so the bottom part of the esrog. And that created a big shiloh about, I don't know, more than 20 years ago, what to do in such a situation. Is that called hefker, not called hefker, etc. The halacha is, for example, if you own wood of shmita, you're allowed to use it. It's your own personal use. It's not got the halachas of shmita.
You get the hanoch from the light of fire straight away. You get the hanoch from the heat.
That's what the Gemara is answering. That most wood is not used for light; it's used for heat. Heat is something which you get at a later stage. After the wood's been consumed, then you get the pleasure.
If you light it for light.
So you're asking, Rava says most wood is used for fuel. Let's say, but this particular wood is not. The answer is that the Torah was kaveh according to the normal usage of the item. The normal usage.
You get the heat, even if you do that enough from the light and use the light, eventually then you get that enough from the heat.
Yeah, the problem is that's it. So why can't I burn an orange, let's say, to use it for the light? At the end of the day, I am getting pleasure as it's being consumed. The answer is we go after the majority. That's we'll just right. Okay. So more like this. Now here, Rashi goes, it's quite an unusual Rashi. The Rashi says that he had two girsois in front of him, the one which his Rebbe's told him and the one which he thinks is correct. And he writes that he struggled terribly with trying to understand his Rebbe's girsa. He writes a very strong words. He writes like this, "V'torachti min urai." For my youth, I put in effort, b'chod sidei shitas hashas, going through every explanation I could in Gemara, liyashvo k'fi divrei. This is the Rashi about 8 lines from the bottom, to explain it like the words of my Rebbe's. Ve'eni yochel, but I was unable. Because Rashi had a girsa of his Rebbe's, which he said, put all his effort in his youth to explain it, and he was unable. And he admits, though, that he found it in different Gemaras, though not his girsa. I mean, in his Rebbe ben Gershom, and in the Rebbe of Yitzchak ben Menachem, was also not like him, and he was, for the Ma'aseh, Rashi disregards the girsas of his Rebbe's, and he does the girsa which we have, which Rashi says is more compatible. We just say very briefly what we've learned, and the Gemara is now going to say it's a machlokes tanoim. The question is, what is a machlokes tanoim? The way Rashi understands it is, the machlokes tanoim is, in a case where you've got normal firewood, which you're using for normal heating, is that a normal shmita usage, and therefore does it have kedusha shmita or not? This very question, does firewood have the halachas of shmita or not? That is a machlokes tanoim, right? That's the words of the Gersa we've got it. The eitzim la Succa, wood which is made for fuel, tanoim is machlokes tanoim, whether it's got kedusha shmita or not. It would make no difference to the lulav. Why would it make no difference to the lulav? It's not used for fuel. What's the lulav used for? Sweeping. And therefore, everybody would agree that it's got kedusha shmita. Everybody would agree with the lulav. It would make a difference for a log of wood. Rashi's Rebbes had a very, very similar girsa, but this is the girsa they had. The girsa they had was the stam eitzim lahasoken in tanohi, which is what Rava came along. Rava said that even if you've got a piece of wood which you choose to use as a lamp, the halacha is it does not have the halachas of Shemitah, because most wood is used for fuel. This chiddush of Rava, that even a wood which is being used for a lamp, which you would under normal circumstances say, well, that must be the halachas of Shemitah to it, even that, says the Gemara is machlokes Tanoim. So that's really what you are arguing, that something which is used for a lamp should be for should have halachas of Shemitah. Tesis points out that even though Rashi over here writes, I was unable to explain it, the Ma'aser Rashi Bava Kama brings the gears of his Rebbes and he explains it. He struggles with the fact that Rashi contradicts himself. The explanation there in Bava Kama though is a difficult one. We're going to stick to more of the explanation over here. So we're going to have a machlokes Tanoim regarding normal firewood. Does it have Kedusha Shemitah or not? We're going to be machlokes Tanoim and then we're going to go through it. Tentanya, we learned in the Brisa. You're not allowed to use the fruit of Shemitah, not for soaking and not for washing. Let's say you have, let's say, grapes. And what you want to do with it is to put them in a big vat and to dip your clothes in it, thereby making your clothes clean, right? Or you've got linen clothes. Linen clothes are very hard. You want to soften them. So you want to soak your clothes in a vat made out of Shemitah fruit. The Tanna Kama says it is forbidden. Why is it forbidden? And again, Rashi and Bava Kama contradict themselves, and there's actually an afkimina. If anybody gets an afkimina, then deserve definitely l'chaim. Let's go through very slowly because the difference is very subtle. You're not allowed to use fruit of Shemitah to soak your linen clothes to make them soft, or to wash your clothes. Why? Because we said a few minutes ago, you always has to be that the pleasure is at the same time as the consumption. And here the pleasure is not the same time as the consumption. Rashi over here says the reason is you dip your clothes inside and then they get soft, they get clean. When do you get pleasure, says Rashi? When you wear them. That's what Rashi says over here. Which is long after you've ruined the fruit. Because once you dip your clothes inside it, you're no longer going to get pleasure. Rashi Bava Kama says that it's not the same time. Why is it not the same time? Because you dip your clothes in and you get pleasure once they are soft, once they are clean. But that takes a few minutes. And when did the fruit get ruined? At the beginning. And therefore, says Rashi, that is not considered a Hano and things. So both Rashi and Bava Kama are very similar. Rashi over here says the pleasure is only when you wear it. Rashi Bava Kama says the pleasure is when you see your clean clothes. Both of them are not going to be at the same time as when the fruits get ruined. Tesis says that Rashi Bava Kama is correct. Rashi here is wrong. He's very strong about it. This is the bottom Tesis. And there's an afkimina halacha lemaisa. Anybody have the halacha lemaisa? It's a good one. No, much more simple. Like this, if you want to make your clothes colorful, so what happens is you take pomegranates. Well, every year we have Rosh Hashanah, the children wear nice summer clothes, and the first thing is they eat the pomegranates, and that's the end of the nice summer clothes. So the problem is to take them off, just for them off. The Maisa, you want to dip your clothes in pomegranate juice. There, says Tesis, it would be okay according to Rashi and Bava Kama, and no good according to Rashi here. Why? Because if you say the pleasure is when you wear it, well, when you're going to wear it, it's long after you've ruined the pomegranate, because you wear it, let's say, you don't wear it as you dip it in, leave it there, I don't know, for a day or two, I've never done it, and then you wear it a day or two later, so it's already not the same time. But if the pleasure is watching it getting dyed, that happens immediately. You see it happening in front of your eyes. So according to Rashi Bava Kama, the whole problem is because the dyeing and the cleaning takes time.
It's also when dries maybe as well.
No, there's a difference between soaking to something to make a clothes soft, which takes a few hours, or to make something clean, where it takes time. In the washing machine, it takes half an hour to get clean. To dyeing. Dyeing is if you pour a pot of paint of your shirt, it'll be black. What?
It's very difficult to dry when it's wet. maybe you want that try.
That's not Tissa. Tissa says, therefore, according to Rashi Bava Kama, you would be allowed to paint your clothes with Shemitah fruit. According to Rashi over here, not. Rashi Tissa seems to prefer. Okay, but either way, the Tanna Kama says you're not allowed to soak your clothes, not allowed to clean your clothes with the fruit of Shemitah. Why not? Why not? Why not? The consumption and the pleasure is not the same time. Rabbi Yosef and Moishe. Rabbi Yosef says you're allowed to. Rabbi Yosef says you're allowed to. And already straight away, you can work out that's the machlekes regarding firewood. What did we say? The Gemara is going to examine this in depth, but you can already see straight away the basic point over here. What's the problem with firewood? Is that you're not getting the pleasure straight away. You only have to get consumed, they get pleasure. That's the same as the clothes which are getting soaked and softened. But Rabbi Yossi that says that you can use the fruit of Shemitah to soak your clothes holds that you would allow you to use the wood of Shemitah to burn. Why? Because it doesn't matter if there's a few hours gap. Rabbi Yossi doesn't mind the gap. Mashenkin Tanna Kama, who says that there's no gap, that you have to make sure, right? Then according to Tanna Kama, you will not be allowed to. So the shaila regarding using firewood for Shemitah is the same shaila. Can you use the fruit of Shemitah to soak or to clean your clothes? Now the Gemara just tries to examine what's the machlokes. The Gemara doesn't come back anymore to this tanoi. The Gemara now just examines what's the svol machlokes. My time to Tanna Kama. La'ochlo means, as we explained previously, all things which are similar to eating. And the thing about eating is the consumption of pleasure at the same time. Not for soaking and not for washing. For you means for whatever you wish. Now each one we're going to examine what we do the other possible. Lochem teaches you that if the Torah would have just said la'ochla, you'd have thought only eating and nothing else. Says the Torah lochem la'ochla, that anything which is similar to eating, which you enjoy, you're allowed to do. For example, sweeping with a lulav, which we'll see, which is their pleasure and consumption at the same time. So the Torah says la'ochla, eating, lochem for you for all pleasures. The Chachamim hold lochem for you for all pleasures, as long as it's similar to la'ochla, that you're going to consume and get pleasure at the same time. But the Torah says clearly for eating, not for all other pleasures. However, not for medication. Rabbi Yossi agrees you're not allowed to use the fruit of Shemitah for medication. For example, if you looked up in the Swan, some people have the minute to dip the fingers into the Kiddush, into the Havdalah, and put it on the eyes. In the year of Shemitah, you can't do that. Why not? Lachem le'ochla for you, which is for normal. The reason we do it is as a kind of medication. So that is forbidden. What? You're not allowed to spill over. Very good. You're not allowed to spill it over either. Maybe even washing should be forbidden. Lochem includes washing. For eating and off medication. Rabbi asks of himself, why do I include washing and exclude medication? What's the difference? Top of the memo base. All people need to wash their clothes. Which doesn't apply to all people. Not everybody needs medication. So let's summarize. We've got Machlekes Tanna Kama Rabbi Yossi. Both of them actually dash on both two words, lochem la'ochla. The Tanna Kama says lochem for you for all pleasures, as long as it's la'ochla, the consumption and the pleasures at the same time. Rabbi Yossi says lochem for all pleasures, la'ochla, as long as it's something which everybody needs, like washing, soaking your clothes, eating, firewood is fine according to Rabbi Yossi. Now, shaking according to the Tanna Kama, you can't use it for firewood. Why can't you use it for firewood? Because even though everybody needs it, but the pleasure and the consumption is not at the same time, and the Tanna Kama requires a much more narrow understanding of what la'ochla comes to teach us. Man Tana who says this of the Brisa la'ochla lugma, for eating, not for medication, la'ochla ziluf. In the olden days, if you want to make a nice smell, you'd pour wine over your fire. La'ochla, I have to tell you this story. Oh, later, to start with it. My grandfather, was nifter. He told me that when he was a bacher, he estek You would go to every day, you would be invited to another person for a meal. So it was in yeshiva, and you would get to eat dinner every day by a different person. What happened was a shipment of kippers came into Manchester port, which was, everybody was very poor in Manchester in those days, but people struggled terribly. You can't imagine the wealth we lived to compared to those days. And what happened was every housewife thought to themselves, I'll treat my bocha to kippers. And what happened was he said for 2 weeks, he got kippers every single day. And he couldn't anymore. And one time, he walked into the room, and a woman came in with a big plate of kippers. I don't think I've ever eaten kippers. Here, special treat for my bocha. She walked out of the room, and there was a fireplace, because in those days, they had no radiators. So he threw the kippers into the fireplace. And she came back in a few minutes later. She said, wow, you finished the whole plate, I'll get you another. She said, it's an interesting smell in here. I wonder where the smell is from. He didn't know what to do. He said, no, thank you. And they left. If you want to get a nice smell, you pour the wine, but that you can't do even according to Rabbi Yossi. Why not? Because that's not something which everybody does for. I picked the reason. Everybody knows what I picked the reason is. It's a medication to make you throw up more. And Beitza talks about the fact that there were some people that were very wealthy, who would eat and eat and eat, they couldn't eat anymore. So what would they do? Would take this thing, make them throw up, and then they could eat more. Rashi says, I pick to throw out, tefei, too much, zin, food. Zin is food. Azon is solam kuloi. Tefei means too much. I pick to visit, to throw out the too much food. So you're not allowed to, let me just finish off this sentence of Rabbi Yossi. So 3 things you're not allowed to, not for medication, not for fire, and not to make a nice smell, and not to throw up. Keman, who is it like? Rabbi Yossi. It must be Rabbi Yossi. Why must this price be like Rabbi Yossi? The Chachamim agree to all of this. If the price was really going like the Chachamim, we could say even a bigger chiddush, not just these things which are quite rare, but even things which everyday usage, like washing your clothes, you can't use the Perush Shmita for. Like this, the Chachamim, they limit Perush Shmita for much more. This price that tells you that you're not allowed to use it for medication and for throwing up and to make a nice smell, that is obviously only Shittas Rabbi Yossi. Shittas Chachamim, they would forbid you for much more. Okay, we have finished the sugya of what to do with the fruit of Shmita. We're starting a new sugya, which a few questions actually yesterday had to do with this. What did you want to say? Sorry, Shai, what did you say? Okay. So if you've got a fruit of Shmita and you want to be mechaled, then we're going to discuss exactly what that helps for. It can only be done through purchase. That means when it comes to most hektish things, you've got 2 choices. Let's say, for example, I makdish this box of tissues. You can be makdish a box of tissues. If I makdish this box, it's not mine, so I can't be makdish it. If it was mine, I was makdish it. What happens to it? You know, so it goes to the gizbar, goes to the administrator of English, and he then chooses to sell it, to redeem it, etc. So you got a choice either to redeem it or to sell it. When it comes to Perush Shmita, you got no choice of redeeming, only selling. Rabbi Loza, lost the place. That was Rabbi Loza. You can either sell it or redeem it. It's a very subtle difference, but it is a difference. Do you redeem Perush Shmita by just saying the Perush Shmita, for example, I don't need to come to you, I don't need you at all. I've got a bunch of oranges here. There's some pound coins here. I say the Perush of the orange kedusha is going to the coins. Or do I have to actually sell it? It means get somebody to buy it off me, and then that way the Perush Shmita, the kedusha transfers. My time of trouble also. The next topic is the Torah talks about buying and selling. The fact that the Torah puts the 2 topics next to each other, 2 seemingly no connection topics, the halachas of Shmita, buying and selling. The Torah is teaching you that the only way to redeem the Perush of Shmita is through buying and selling. Rabbi Yochanan, my time, why does Rabbi Yochanan say that you're allowed to sell it or redeem it? Yovel is Kodesh, and Yovel and Shmita are always interchangeable. The halachas of Yovel and Shmita are the same. Just like all hektish, you can redeem or sell. So each one dashes a different place. Either from the fact that it says Kodesh, it's like hektish, or from the fact that it puts the halachas of buying and selling next to it, tells us both things. What does it do with the fact that the Torah puts the halachas of buying and selling next to the halachas of Shmita? What's the Torah teaching us? This is a part of a statement of Rabbi Yosef Chadina, which actually goes on for much, much, much longer. Rashi himself writes, look at words of Rashi, Rabbi Yosef Chadina, Maseches Erechin, Arucha hi me'oid. It's a very, very long statement. Anybody know where it's brought down? This very long statement of Rabbi Yossi. Rashi, the end of Parshas Bahar, those who will notice, Rashi brings the entire statement. And what Rabbi Yossi does, he connects the entire Parsha of Parshas Bahar. In Parshas Bahar, the Torah talks about a dozen different topics. It starts off with Shemitah, then Yovel, then buying and selling items, then buying and selling property, then lending beribis, then selling your home, then selling your field, then selling yourself as a slave, then selling yourself as a slave to a goy. Those are the main topics of the whole Parshas Bahar. Because of he asks the question, I don't understand. It's a whole random events. And what does he answer? That we're talking about somebody that did not keep the halachas of Shemitah properly. And therefore, as a punishment, Hashem said, if that's the case, you'll be forced into poverty. And there are different levels of poverty. The lowest level of poverty is you have to sell items. That's very easy to sell. Who cares? Sell an old shirt that you have. That's very easy to sell. But then afterwards, you get even more poor if you don't keep the mitzvah correctly. Let's say you don't sell honestly. If you try and cheat the buyer when you sell your old shirt, then eventually you have to borrow. And eventually you struggle to borrow. You'll have to borrow with interest. And if you still don't behave correctly, you'll end up selling your home, which is much worse than selling your fields. And then eventually selling yourself into slavery, and eventually selling yourself into slavery to a good. So he makes like a chain of the whole parsha. So now we ask the question, what's the connection between halachas of Shemitah and buying and selling? Rabbi Loza told us what's the connection, that the only way to redeem the fruit of Shemitah is through buying and selling. Rabbi Yechon says, no, the connection is a much more fundamental one. It's to teach you the punishment of somebody that buys and sells the Shemitah and doesn't behave himself correctly. What will happen to him is he'll have to end up buying and selling his items. Now, Rashi and Tosfos both disturbed by the word avko shel shvius, the dust of shvius. In one way, is this person who's not keeping the halachas correctly being over avak lashon hara? We all know is that instead of doing the real avir of lashon hara, you say something which is like a secondary, nice English word. That's the sort of thing, not secondary. The dust of lashon hara. What would you call it in English? A what? Incidental lashon, no, maybe. Nice. Why is it called avak of shvius? So look at Tosfos. This is more about second Tosfos. The main avir of Shemitah is planting, growing. All the other things is a loisa say, etc. The buying and selling is only a say. Okay, so eventually sell his things. Since he tried to buy and sell incorrectly the fruit of Shemitah, which is the dust of Shemitah, because it's not the main halachas of Shemitah, because the main halachas of Shemitah is not to work your property, not to work your ground. We'll end up with all these things. Again, let's go back to the Torah tells us the halachas of Shemitah and buying and selling together, not to teach you the halacha of, like Rabbi Loza said, you're only allowed to do it through selling, but to teach you the halacha that if a person doesn't behave as Shemitah, he'll end up having to sell his things. Rabbi Loza, I called Rabbi Yechon, what does he do with the pasuk of Rabbi Yechon, which says Kodesh, we burn the Tanya. Do you really Kodesh? Just like by hektish, if I makdish this box of tissues and then I redeem the box of tissues onto money, the kedusha of the tissues now goes onto the money. Also by Shemitah, the kedusha of Shemitah transferred to the money, and you have to treat the money with all the halachas of kedusha Shemitah. Tanya kvosid Abelazar, but Tanya kvosid Abichim. Tanya kvosid Abelazar. We have a bias like Abelazar. Shvius tefesses estomer. Shvius takes over, it grabs the kedusha of its money. Shenema kiveli kodesh shelochem. Ma kodesh tefesses estomer v'asav shvius tefesses estomer v'asur. So just like kodesh, the kedusha is transferred also by Shemitah. Now somebody asked, I think Shah asked yesterday, Ima kodesh tefesses estomer v'yotze l'chulin. If I have a box of tissues and I makdish it to the Beis Hamikdash, after I redeem it, what can I do with the tissues? Anything I want. Do anything literally what I want with it. Shvius, you might have thought the festus the Merbi, it says the Chulin. You might have thought that by the Peros of Shemitah, they should also go to Chulin. They remain Kodesh. Can you imagine such a thing? So if I've got a bunch of oranges, which got Kedusha Shemitah, and I redeem them on a £5 note, then what happens is the Kedusha of the oranges remain, and the £5 note also has Kedusha Shemitah. What will it mean that the £5 note has Kedusha Shemitah? What does that mean? Can't buy shoes. Very good. What else? If, for example, there's no oranges left in the country, I have to be mafkid. I've told this late time, my neighbor. He learned that Tel Shlomo, Sorotzkin's pillow. Sorotzkin has about 2,000 avechim in his pillow. Can you imagine 2,000 avechim in his pillow? So before Pesach, he gave every one of his avechim 24 bottles of wine, 48,000 bottles. Can you imagine? So Shlomo Sorotzkin, he was very close to Baal Leib. And what happened was, a few weeks later, there was no grapes left. And all the wine has to become hefker, because the halacha of bio is that if there's no fruit left on the vine, in the hefker, then what happens is, you have to be mafki, you have to get rid of everything that you've got in your house. You have to take it out and make it mafka. So my neighbor goes outside with his 24 bottles of wine. He says, hefka, you can take it. But nobody was going to take it. He said to me, take at least one bottle that I should feel that it's real hefka. I wasn't going to do that to him. Once you're mafki it, we pass him, as Machlik is showing him, you're then allowed to take it back in. And then he took it back in and he kept his 24 bottles of wine. But this is the idea of bill. So for example, if you've got a bunch of oranges and you redeem it onto £5 notes, and then the basis will put up signs in the shul. There's no oranges left in the fields. You have to take the £5 note, put it outside, and stand in front of 3 people and say hefker, and hope that you've got good neighbors that won't do it. But the Maisa, the word says like this. Now we go through a cheshbon, kedai to work it through. Let's say you took with the oranges, you bought some meat. Elu ve'elu misparin b'shvis, but the halachas of shmita. The meat has the halacha of shmita, and the oranges have the halacha of shmita. For example, you won't be allowed to. What will you not be allowed to do with the meat? Sell it to the business way, maybe, but something much more obvious. Use it as medication. We just had before. Fruit of shmita can't be used as medication, or you can't use it, for example, if you want to need to throw up because you want to eat more. You can't use the meat of shmita because it's got kedusha shmita inside it. Look at the boss of talking. Now here it gets more complicated. You had oranges, and with it you bought meat. With the meat you bought fish, which is okay, because fish is okay. Then what happens? Then the meat is not kaddish anymore, the fish is. So what is kaddish now? The oranges and the fish. The meat loses its kedusha. Why? Even though the original fruit, when you transfer the kedusha remains on the original fruit and on the thing you transferred to. But the thing you transferred to, when you transfer that to another thing, so that second thing does not have kedusha anymore. I hope it's clear.
What's the point of redeeming it then if you
No, because let's say you need to do something with it. You don't want to eat all the oranges. You've got no choice.
You still have the shvius oranges after.
Yeah, but whoever buys it from you will have it. But at least you've got a problem with it. Let's say you've got too many oranges. What are you going to do with it? You can't chuck them. So then you've given them to me and I give you meat. So now I will have the kedusha of the oranges and you will have the kedusha of the oranges on the meat. But if then afterwards you say, I don't want the meat, I'll stop it with Ben, and he gives you fish, then Ben will have the meat. He will have kedusha shmita on the meat. He won't be able to use it for medication, for throwing up, or to make a nice smell in his house. I will have the kedusha on the oranges, but you now will be able to eat the fish and do whatever you want with it. You can use it for medication, etc. Lokach v'dogim yain, you buy wine with the fish. You also dog with nichlas yain. Lokach b'yain shemen with wine. You buy oil. You also dog with yain with nichlas shemen. Okay, tzad. Achron nichlas b'shvis. The very last has the halachas of shvis. Or periatzvei os miditoni lokach. The Brisa always talks about the case of buying. So we see clearly from this Brisa that it doesn't once mention redeeming, but always buying. The halacha is only through buying and selling, not through redeeming. Can be redeemed. Whether they're alive or dead. The shit is some. Why? What's Rachamim oimim al shchutim mischalin and chayin in mischalin? You're allowed to on shchutim, not the ones that are alive. You might grow from them flocks. Now, look at the bottom line of Rashi, the very bottom line on this page. B'shvis, actually, what's wrong with buying animals with fruit of shmita if they're alive? Who cares? What's the problem? You'll grow them to have flocks, and so what? The problem is, as Rashi explains, and you can read the whole Rashi, that what will happen is like this. I've got oranges. I say to you, give me a sheep for the oranges. You give me a sheep. I'll then grow flocks. Meanwhile, there's no oranges left in the field. What do I have to do? I have to get rid of the sheep. I won't want to, because I've just been working for the past 3 months, developing these sheep and growing a whole flock. I'm not going to kill them all out now. So therefore, I'm not going to shech them all and eat them straight away. So if a chazal didn't allow you to redeem it on live animals, dead animals, which you're going to eat straight away, there's no chashash. Rashi tells us the same halacha by Moishe, there's a chiyuv to do bio Moishes. But one thing we see clearly is that you can redeem it. So we've got a machlokas of Bichler of Laza. Can you redeem it to just thing or thing? I want just do 3 more lines. Omar Rova machlokas stuff of Mamala from Adalef is chayim. And when the cave is females, female animals, they can give birth straight away. Male ones are only useful in order to regulate the female ones. So Rava tells us that everybody agrees that we're chayshish, you might start develop breeding, and we don't want you to breed. And therefore, both the male and the chamim are not reluctant that you should buy animals for breeding only. The male goes whether they're male or they're female. The Chachamim only forbid it if they're female. If they're male, they're not chayshish because they're not that needed that much. You can have one male for many females. You don't need males as much for breeding, and therefore not chayshish. Okay, we're up to 3 lines from the top of Rashi. Let's hope it gets the Mishnah. Yes.
I said it's nice to do English.
It was hectic. I thought so. Bye. Yes. Shada by hectic. If what?
Indian forms.
I think yes. Yeah, go for it. Yes, I think yes.
Did you manage to check?
I couldn't find it. I know I've got a picture where it is on the back. I looked for a few minutes. I couldn't find it. He said he learns US Shemai from Sulla. Yes. Oh, that's right. I look again today. Okay. Do you have a mobile or something? Which you do. You have it.
I got your number.
No, so